So if you've got your Bibles there, open them up to Hebrews chapter 1 and we'll read the first 4 verses. And we'll look at something a little bit different that we didn't look at. And what am I supposed to do with this board? Wendy? Throw it away. That's better. Okay, so the first 4 verses. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophet at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became a much superior to the angels. I've read that wrong, haven't I? To the angels, as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. Now, if I muddle a little bit, I'm having a bit of trouble seeing. Those lights don't work, correct? Okay. All right, so the little bit I want to hone in on this morning, which we didn't touch on the lesson, there's that little phrase there, that little clause, and it says, after he had provided purification for sins. And I want you to think about that this morning. And I just want to break that up into 3 sections, that little clause. He, who is he? What's the problem? And how he deals with it. Let's consider this. Let's never forget for a moment that he is a person. He's a person here. And he's dealing with something. That person is alive. All this is just here in these 4 verses. He laid down his life for us. He loves, he thinks, he feels. And to prove he's not a ghost, he eats fish after he was raised. He has a body. He rose from the tomb. He has some special qualities, I'll give you that. He was recognised by his followers. They touched him to prove that he wasn't a ghost. So there's a person here who we're going to relate to forever and ever. He's alive today. It goes on in verse 4 there. He's alive and he sits down at the right hand of the Father. Now, I don't want to go into too much what that means, but sitting down at the right hand to the Jews, and that in those days had a special, he's got nearly all the power that the Father has by sitting at the right hand. He promises, he makes promises to us, and some of those are very dear. He promises never to leave or forsake us. He's in this room right now. Sometimes we take his presence a little bit light, but he's sitting here right now. He's probably sitting as close to you as the person next to you. So he's real. Don't ever forget to cultivate this relationship with God. I've heard it said not that long ago. Rex is always saying it. We need this personal relationship with God. And that's been a big thing in the churches, probably in the last, 20 years probably, to have this relationship with God. Do you have a personal relationship with him? Sometimes we take it lightly. This glorious person that can be right with us. Now, if we look down a little bit, we'll see the various attributes of Jesus. There in verse 3, or verse 2, is it? He creates all things. Verse 3, he has the radiance of God's glory. He is the exact representation of his being. He sustains all things. That's something we don't look at probably enough. That our very existence depends on God. And if he ceased to sustain us, we would cease to exist. So he's involved with us all the time. He's the exact character of God. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So if you want to see God the Father, you read the Gospels, you get an insight into Jesus, and you see the Father. And then the next thing we see there, he upholds the universe. We're just starting to see in our day and age just how big the universe is. And now that new telescope's going up, we're going to get a new insight. But what Hubble and that has shown us, I was watching it on some of the TV and some of the photos and I'm thinking, God has control over all that. He speaks it into existence. I don't understand that. I don't understand it. But then when Job was having trouble with God, and he was wondering where God was, and God says, Job, take a look up. You control any of that? I do that by just speaking. And Job said, well, that's good enough for me. I'll stop arguing about it. And then after he's done all that, he sits down at the right hand of God. He sits down. His seating there is an enthronement. It's an enthronement. And he reigns. He reigns completely. Today he's in charge of everything. He's in charge of everything that's good, and he could be in charge of everything that's bad, including COVID. All under his power. And today we're talking about a person that is real. He's real. Now the problem we're dealing with here is the sin problem. It's the sin problem. Let's pick up this sin problem a little bit, because I've become very aware lately in the last few years that sin's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. But here it says he makes purification for sin, or for sins. It's a power, it's in the world, sin. Sin just isn't like we think, what is sin? Oh, it's breaking the commandments. No, it's not. Sin's a lot more than that. It's a force, it's a power, it's within us, it drives us, and we can't do anything about it. It's what we are. If you read Romans, it gives you a little insight into it. It's just not an isolated deed that we do here and there. Sin is awful. And everybody that's alive today is infected with it. We know as we talk about COVID, we know just how infectious COVID can be. Well, we're starting to get an insight into that in Australia. Sin's worse. We're all infected with sin. It's lethal. And the curse of sin is going to affect us all. For all of us, if we live long enough, we're going to die. That's sin. That's the effect of sin. If we look in Hebrews 3, and we'll look at that now, Hebrews 3, 14 to 19. We get a little insight. Got that right? We have come to share in Christ if we hold firmly till the end the confidence we had first. As he just said, today, if I hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. Now this is talking about when they came to the borders of to Canaan. And they hardened their heart in that they didn't have faith that God could deliver them into Canaan. God took that very personally. And here he's talking about it here. Who were they who heard the rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt? So he's reminding them here, they've rebelled, they've hardened their heart, they didn't have faith that God could take them into the promised land. But he said, who led you out of Egypt? Who took you through the Red Sea? Who got rid of the Egyptian army? Surely the Egyptian army was a lot bigger than these Canaanites and so forth that they were entering into. So they lost their faith, and God took that very personally. He said, okay, none of you are going to enter Canaan. So 40 years later, they're back there, and they've all died except the faithful ones. Verse 17 again. And with whom was their anger for 40 years? So it's talking of God and his anger for 40 years. Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the desert? And to whom did God swear they would never enter their rest? If not for those that disobeyed. So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Sin is rooted in unbelief. Now, I just want you to think about this morning because I just want to deal with this little clause here. I want you to realise that they didn't enter Canaan because they did not trust God. They didn't trust him. He'd given them plenty of evidence to trust him, but they didn't trust him. And when God says, I'm going to do things, he makes promises. He says, I'm going to forgive people of their sins. We need to take him at his word and to trust him. I'm mindful just of a little story, and Matt probably could give you a better background of this, but this girl that's in a Catholic church and they're going up for the communion service. And this one girl was feeling terribly guilty. And she's up there and he's about to put the bread in her mouth. So they do it a little bit different. The biscuit on the mouth. She said, no, I can't. I just don't feel I can take that. And the priest was a wise old fellow anyway. He looks at her and he says, take it. It's for sinners. It's for sinners. The gospel is for people who know how bad they are. The gospel is a relationship. It's involved in having this relationship with God. These people know really how bad they are. They know that they've messed up, and we all mess up. We make the wrong choices. But God answers back and he says, I've made a provision for those choices. I've made a provision for those choices. So I just want you to think now, just summarising that little bit, that sin is evil. It's a force, it's in the world, it's something that we all suffer with, this disease. And now I'll have a look at the thing that we know about, which is disobedience. We all know what disobedience is. But I don't know that we've looked on it in this slide so much. And if we look in verse 18, I get it. And to whom did God swear they would never enter their rest, if not for those who disobeyed? So he took it very serious with them. And God takes sin very seriously. And I often wondered, why does he take it so seriously? Why does he... He knows what we are, he knows where we live. Why is it such a big thing? Surely he can overlook it in some way, make it easier for us. No, but when you realise what God has done, what he's made and what sin's done to it, it's why he hates it so much. We're very quick today to say God is a loving God. You know, 200 years ago, if you're you could have been in this church, or the one out the front. No, it's not that old. But anyway, 100 years ago, they talked about a judgmental God. Not the loving God that we talk about so much today. And if you look at history, the Christianity, they were scared of this judgmental God. And for a long time in my early life, I was scared of a judgmental God. Very scared. Oh, you muck up here. Yes, yes. And then I was fearful of this, and then I was fearful of that. And then in later life, I went to the army, and I was still fearful of a judgment. This angry God that was going to do away with sin and with sinners. And to some extent, that is true. God is very angry with sin. But he's also a loving God. So when you come to the cross, we see God's justice and he's having to do things to deal with sin, but we also see his mercy. Now I just want to look where I've really been heading, and only for a couple of minutes. Had made purification. It says there in verse 3, is it? After he had provided purification for the sins, the NIV says. I think the older translations will say he has made it. And now we see the gospel. Had made purifications for sin. And after he does that, he sits down on the right hand of God. And when he sits down, he's sitting down with his work completed. He's done his job. So we look here a little bit more at this. It's important to understand this. It's not saying is making purification for sin. It's had made. It's not saying will make. Has been made. The purification was made once and for all. And God's blood 2,000 years ago will never be repeated. It'll never be repeated. His blood once and for all. And the sins that you commit on your dying day have been dealt with. Have been dealt with. I mean, we can abuse this gospel, and Paul talks about it. Oh, well, let's keep sinning that grace may abound. No, that's not how it works. He's made purification for sin. It's finished. It's a decisive thing. He's done his work. He enters heaven and he sits down at the right hand of God with his work completed. I just want to take you through a few more texts so you just don't think that this is something that I'm driving home, and it's one of my favourite little subjects. I know there's difference of opinions on some of these things, but I'm just telling you what I think this morning. Let's look in Hebrews 7:26 to 27 as I run you through a few of these texts. And it's talking about Jesus as a high priest, which we're going to go through all this quarter in the lessons. Such a high priest meets our need, one who was holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day. First for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrifices for their sins once for all. When he offered himself. Again, we can just go over the couple more pages into 9, 11 and 12. When Christ came as the high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, that's the one in heaven, which is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of his creation. He did not enter by the means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all. By his own blood, having attained eternal redemption. He entered it once and for all. Using his own blood, he obtained eternal redemption. He's making this purification that he talked about earlier. Let's have a look in 25, 26 of the same chapter. If I can see well enough to find it. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood that is not his own. Then Christ would have to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with the sin by sacrificing of himself. So again, at the end of the ages. Now, I should have explained this. At the end of the ages, when we're talking about the end of the ages here, this writer is talking from when time he's writing to the end of the ages. So it's the last 2,000 years are the end of the ages. Anything past Christ in this sense is the end of the ages. So we see that Christ has dealt with sin once and for all. He's paid the price. It's complete. Now, if I want to, I'd like you to look at Hebrews 9, 27, 28, just following on from where we were. Just as a man is destined to die once, and after that to face the judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And you know who I think the many people are. He will appear a second time, not to bear sins, but to bring salvation. If we go over now to Hebrews, we've got just a couple more verses. Hebrews 10, 11 and 12. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered at all times one sacrifice for sins, he sits down at the right hand of God. One sacrifice for sins. And he sat down. His sacrifice was perfect in every way. It's been accepted by the Father. The sin problem has been dealt with. He's made that purification that we read about earlier on. And when we come into this union with Christ, we have this relationship with Christ that we talk about a lot today. The Father accepts us as he accepted Christ, for we are perfected in him. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. But today, as we leave this place, we can have the confidence that God accepts us. It's an amazing thing, really, to think. We don't have to have this attitude, well, I'll now do what's right and God will cover all my sins in the past and now I'm going to live by faith. It's not that. God has perfected us already, total, complete. The things that we've done in the past, the things that we're going to do in the future. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to be saved. Because these are a special band of people. And like the song said at the beginning, who wrote that, Wendy? Frederick, what was it? I don't know. Anyway, I'm just trying to think of who wrote it. But he dreamed and he saw heaven. This is not a dream, this is reality where God has done what he said he would do. And we can live now being in a relationship with God that saves us, being perfected in Christ. What a wonderful thing if we can get hold of that.